Right now, as you watch this, your brain is consuming about 20% of every calorie your body has available. 20%. Your brain weighs roughly 1.4 kilograms. Your body weighs, let's say, 70 kilograms. That means an organ representing 2% of your total body mass is burning 1/5 of all the energy you produce. No other animal on Earth does this. Not the gorilla, not the chimpanzee, not any creature that has ever walked, swum, or flown across this planet. And for most of the history of science, nobody could explain how we got away with it. Because feeding a brain like ours is genuinely mathematically impossible. Unless you do one specific thing. Unless you cook your food. Let's begin with the number that should stop you cold. If modern humans ate the way our primate relatives eat, raw food gathered through the day, we would need to spend 9.5 hours every single day chewing and eating just to generate enough calories to keep our brains and bodies running. Neuroscientist Susanna Herculano-Houzel from Vanderbilt University ran this calculation precisely, and the result is not close. She counted the number of neurons in the brains of 13 species of primates and found that the energy a brain requires is a direct linear function of the number of neurons it contains. A gorilla with a brain far smaller than ours still needs to spend roughly 8.5 hours per day eating to sustain it. Orangutans, about 7.5 hours. Chimpanzees, roughly 7 hours. And for a human brain, with its 16 billion cortical neurons, the most of any primate, raw food alone would demand 9.5 hours of feeding every single day. There are not enough hours of usable daylight for that. The gorilla is already at its absolute limit. This is why, as Herculano-Houzel puts it, gorillas and orangutans have brains that are smaller than they should be for the size of their bodies. They are pressed against an energetic ceiling they cannot break through. The human brain, 3 times larger than a gorilla's, should be impossible. And it would be, except that somewhere in our evolutionary past, an ancestor of ours discovered a way to radically increase the caloric yield of everything they ate. They discovered that cooking food makes it yield roughly 3 times as many calories, 3 times. The same piece of meat, the same tuber dug from the ground. Cooked, it feeds you 3 times more efficiently than raw. That discovery did not merely change how we ate, it changed what we were. This is why, as Herculano-Houzel puts it, gorillas and orangutans have brains that are smaller than they should be for the size of their bodies. They are pressed against an energetic ceiling they cannot break through. The human brain, 3 times larger than a gorilla's, should be impossible. And it would be, except that somewhere in our evolutionary past, an ancestor of ours discovered a way to radically increase the caloric yield of everything they ate. They discovered that cooking food makes it yield roughly 3 times as many calories. 3 times. The same piece of meat, the same tuber dug from the ground. Cooked, it feeds you 3 times more efficiently than raw. That discovery did not merely change how we ate, it changed what we were. The researchers analyzed the crystal size and found that the teeth had been heated to a controlled, relatively low temperature, consistent with deliberate cooking rather than a wildfire or accidental burning. The age of the teeth, 780,000 years old. At a stroke, this pushed the hard, direct evidence of controlled cooking back by more than 600,000 years, beyond what had previously been documented. The creature doing the cooking was almost certainly Homo erectus, an early human whose anatomy was already beginning to carry the signature of a cooked diet, even if the archaeology is still catching up to the biology. But the fire story may go back even further. A cave in South Africa's northern Cape, named Wonderwerk, the Afrikaans word for miracle, has been yielding evidence of fire for decades. A 2026 study published in PLOS One found signs of repeated fire use in the cave's deepest layers, in deposits dating to between roughly 1 million and 1.8 million years ago. Burnt bones from small mammals were found in those layers, preserved in ways consistent with human activity rather than natural burning. If those dates hold up under further scrutiny, they would put fire use by Homo erectus and our very close ancestor at almost the very beginning of our genus. Long before we had stone tools of any sophistication. Long before we left Africa. Long before we looked anything like modern humans. Here is the question Harvard biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent his career asking. Wrangham is the author of a book called Catching Fire, published in 2009, and his argument is one of the most consequential and contested ideas in modern paleoanthropology. He argues that cooking did not result from human intelligence. He argues that cooking produced human intelligence. His thesis: the shift to a cooked diet was not something that happened after we became Homo sapiens, or even after we became fully modern Homo erectus. The shift to a cooked diet, he says, is what caused the transformation that produced Homo erectus in the first place. The anatomy tells a compelling story. Roughly 1.8 million years ago, something dramatic happened in the hominin fossil record. Before this point, our ancestors, creatures like Homo habilis and the Australopithecines, had brains averaging around 500 cubic centimeters. Their jaws were large, their teeth were substantial, their gut was capacious, proportioned for processing enormous quantities of tough, fibrous, raw plant food. They looked, in most meaningful ways, more like apes than like us. Then, at roughly 1.8 million years ago, a new creature appears in the record: Homo erectus. The brain of early Homo erectus averaged around 900 cubic centimeters, a 42% increase over Homo habilis in what is, by evolutionary standards, a remarkably short time. The face had shrunk, the jaw muscles had reduced, the teeth were smaller, and, critically, the gut had contracted. The broad barrel-like abdominal region of the Australopithecines, which accommodated a large fermenting gut capable of processing raw plant matter, had given way to a narrower, more streamlined torso. This is the body of a creature that no longer needed to ferment enormous quantities of raw vegetation. This is the body of a creature eating pre-digested food that fire had already broken down. Anthropologists Leslie Alo and Peter Wheeler gave this idea its scientific foundation in a landmark 1995 paper called The Expensive Tissue Hypothesis. Their discovery: the brain and the gut are in direct competition. Both are metabolically expensive organs. Both consume enormous amounts of energy just to exist, before they do anything at all. For any animal, building a larger brain means finding the energy to run it. And the most direct way to free up that energy is to shrink the gut. But you can only shrink the gut if you are eating food that the gut does not need to work very hard to process. Cooked food is softer. Cooked food has already had its cell walls ruptured by heat. Cooked food is, in a very real sense, pre-digested. The gut can extract more calories from it in less time, with far less effort. A smaller gut frees up energy. That freed energy feeds more neurons. More neurons produce more intelligence. More intelligence enables better cooking. The loop closes. But the evidence does not stop at anatomy. It reaches into a problem that almost no one thinks about until it is pointed out. Modern humans cannot survive on raw food. This is not a dietary preference, it is a biological fact. Multiple long-term studies of people who try to eat exclusively raw food have found consistent, serious health consequences, not from what was missing in the raw food, but from the sheer inability of the human digestive system to extract enough energy from it. In one study of nearly 300 women following strict raw food diets over an extended period, a full quarter experienced partial to complete loss of menstruation. The body's way of shutting down reproduction when calories are insufficient to sustain it. These were not malnourished people by any conventional definition. They were eating enormous quantities of fruits, vegetables, and other plant foods. There simply was not enough caloric yield to sustain a human body running a human brain. We have become, at the biological level, dependent on the process our ancestors invented. Richard Wrangham puts it this way: we are the cooking apes. Cooking is not something humans discovered and chose to adopt. Cooking is what we are built for. Every aspect of our digestive anatomy, the small stomach, the shortened intestines, the reduced jaw, the small teeth, is an adaptation to a cooked diet. Take a modern human and force them to eat only raw wild food, and they will begin to deteriorate in ways that have nothing to do with willpower or effort. We are, physically, creatures of the fire. Now let's talk about the jaw, because the story of cooking is written in bone in a way that is startling once you see it. Chimpanzees spend nearly half of every waking day chewing. Their jaw muscles are enormous, anchored to a pronounced crest of bone running along the top of the skull, the sagittal crest, that exists for no other purpose than to give those muscles a larger surface for attachment. The Australopithecines had it too. Homo erectus did not. By a conservative estimate, processing food before eating, even just slicing raw meat with a stone tool rather than tearing it with teeth, reduced the muscular effort required per chew and the total number of chews per day by nearly 20%. Harvard paleoanthropologists Catherine Zink and Daniel Lieberman calculated that the adoption of a diet including sliced and processed meat would have saved early humans roughly 2.5 million chews per year. 2.5 million. Each of those chews requires jaw muscles to contract, which requires energy, which costs calories. Cooking amplified this effect enormously. Cooked meat is dramatically softer than raw meat. Cooked tubers, which constitute a significant part of what modern hunter-gatherers eat, have had their tough cellulose partially broken down. Cooked starch granules are far more bioavailable than raw ones. As the jaw reduced, the face restructured. The massive brow ridges diminished. The protruding snout shortened. The vocal tract, no longer constrained by the architecture of a jaw built for grinding, could develop in new directions. Some researchers have argued that this restructuring of the face and throat was among the preconditions that eventually made complex spoken language physically possible. The mouth that learned to cook may, in this reading, be the mouth that eventually learned to speak. There is another dimension to the cooking story that changes everything, and it has nothing to do with anatomy. It has to do with time. When our primate relatives are not chewing, they are mostly doing one thing, being vigilant, watching for threats, scanning the canopy, alert. A gorilla spending 8 hours eating has almost no cognitive surplus left over. It is not planning, it is not imagining, it is not telling stories, it is eating. Cooking collapsed the time budget of feeding dramatically. Fire broke down the food before it entered the body, doing the work that the gut and jaw had been doing. The result was hours of free time, cognitive surplus, that had never previously existed in the history of primates. And those hours were not spent alone. Hours were fire did a second thing that no other human innovation had ever done. It extended the usable day. All of the great predators that threatened our ancestors across the African landscape were nocturnal. Lions, leopards, hyenas, creatures that hunt by darkness and have adapted senses that far exceed ours in low light. For most of the history of primate life, nightfall meant one thing: stop moving, climb something, and survive until dawn. Fire changed the terms of that equation. A controlled fire in a campsite radiated light and heat and kept predators at a distance. The night became, for the first time, a space where humans could be active, not foraging, not making tools in any precise way, but doing something that turned out to be enormously consequential: talking. University of Utah anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent decades studying the conversational patterns of the Juhon people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. Her analysis of daytime versus firelight conversations revealed something remarkable. During the day, conversations were overwhelmingly practical: food, work, complaints, small social tensions. But at night, gathered around the fire, the pattern shifted completely. 81% of firelight time was devoted to storytelling. Myths, accounts of people living far away, stories of ancestors, experiences with the spirit world. Wiesner described fire as having functioned as the original social media. Stories told around fire did not merely entertain. They transmitted norms. They encoded morality. They described how people far away had solved problems. They built across generations the accumulated cultural knowledge that no single human lifetime could contain. As Robin Dunbar of Oxford University observed, the emergence of language and the emergence of hearths are likely not coincidental. Fire created a space where language could do the work it was built for, and in doing so, accelerated the cultural evolution of the species that sat around it. There is one more dimension of cooking's effect that deserves attention, one that is easy to overlook because it seems mundane beside the architecture of brains and the evolution of language: Cooking kills things: bacteria, parasites, worms, fungi, the invisible passengers that attach themselves to raw meat, and raw plant food in staggering variety. The African savanna, where Homo erectus lived and hunted, was full of game animals that carried their own populations of parasites. Eating those animals raw was a lottery, a continuous exposure to pathogens capable of causing illness, reproductive disruption, and death. Heat neutralizes most of this. A controlled fire, even a modest one, reaches temperatures that destroy the vast majority of dangerous microorganisms in food. The group that cooked got sick less often. The children who ate cooked food survived in larger numbers. Over hundreds of generations, this survival advantage compounded into something profound. Cooking was not merely an energy solution. It was an immune strategy. It was a population strategy. Every hot coal that broke down a parasite cyst contributed invisibly to the demographic success of the creatures who knew how to use it. Let's step back and look at what we've covered, because the full picture is genuinely breathtaking. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, an ancestor of ours, almost certainly Homo erectus, possibly something even earlier, began regularly applying heat to food before eating it. We cannot say exactly when. The oldest direct evidence currently comes from that Israeli lakeshore, 780,000 years ago. The bones from Wonderwork Cave push the probable date of fire use back to perhaps 1.8 million years. What we can say is what happened after. The gut shrank, the jaw reduced, the face restructured. The brain grew, not gradually, but in what reads in the fossil record as a dramatic, relatively rapid expansion. The body freed itself from the 9.5-hour feeding schedule that kept our primate relatives locked at the edge of their cognitive ceiling. The freed time gathered around fire. The fire extended into night. The night became a space for language, for story, for the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. And underneath all of it, silently over hundreds of thousands of years, the reduced exposure to pathogens stacked up into a survival advantage that every human alive today carries in their body. We are the animals that cook. Not because we learned to cook after becoming intelligent, but because we became intelligent, at least in part, because we cooked. The fire did not warm us. The fire made us. Every meal you have ever eaten has been shaped by a discovery your ancestors made on an African plain, more than 1 million years ago. Every conversation you have ever had, every story, every joke, every exchange of ideas, echoes something that began around a campfire in the dark, when the predators stayed back and the night opened up for the first time. That is not a metaphor. That is biology. If this kind of deep history makes you look at the world differently, you are in the right place. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to keep pulling on these threads, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and come back for the next one.